Hi, I'm Alyson and welcome to the Virtual Greenhouse. Closed terrariums are fully functioning ecosystems, just miniaturized. During the day, as the plants photosynthesize, condensation builds up on the inside of the glass vessel. Then, just like rainfall, it trickles down into the soil and gets sucked up by the roots. So you have this lovely continual process happening within the glass vessel. When I first started making terrariums, you couldn't buy terrarium tools like you now can. So I started to make my own DIY toolkit. My kit consists of long chef's tweezers, aquarium scissors, chopsticks for burrowing holes and dropping down plants, a funnel for dropping down stones and soil, kitchen roll for cleaning the inside of the glass vessel, and a pipette or meat baster for administering water as close to the plant's roots as possible. I also create these bamboo stick tools by cutting a cross in the bamboo and sliding in paintbrushes, spoons, forks. The sponge and paintbrushes are for cleaning up and finishing off. The spoon is for digging, and when it's bent, for tamping down soil. The fork makes for a great rake and moss fluffer. First up, you'll need to source your glass vessel. So long as it's glass, anything with a lid will do. Think apothecary bottles, carboys or demijohns. You can also use a clip-top mason jar or just a regular jam jar. Drainage stones such as larger pebbles or slate. Activated carbon or charcoal. This is used in aquarium filters and can be purchased in most aquarium or pet shops. Soil, I like to make my own mixtures, but regular potting soil will do the trick. Slate or decorative stones to sit on the surface of your soil. I like to complete my terrariums with clusters of crystal. You can include shells, rock, ammonites. Always try to keep it tropical. Succulents and cacti will hate the high humidity that builds up in a terrarium. Also, always avoid herbs. Here is a lovely selection of plants that will thrive in your terrarium. This is the Ginseng Ficus. Photonia, or the nerve plant, is always a terrarium favorite. Like the Photonia, these calanthias have lovely patterning on their leaves. Despite the common name, the asparagus fern is not a true fern, but is a member of the asparagus family and creates beautiful canopies of foliage in your terrarium. These pilia over here are also known as friendship plants, so maybe consider using those if you're creating a terrarium gift. If you're looking for something that flowers, try the Ludicea or the jewel orchid. It's a firm favorite of mine. Also maybe try an African violet. They also thrive in terrariums. Now finally over to the moss. I have a selection of bun moss, or also called cushion moss, and sheet moss here. Now, moss is a beautiful addition to your terrarium. It really completes the terrarium, creating little mounds of greenery. To start with, I'm going to add my drainage layer, a few centimeters of drainage stones at the base of the terrarium. Now, because we're working in a closed glass vessel, it doesn't have any holes at the base of it, we need to create this drainage layer. The problem with having moisture in the soil is that it leads to all sorts of nasty things like root rot. Next up is our activated carbon or charcoal. I usually add a couple of spoons of the charcoal, and I just sprinkle it on the surface of the drainage layer. There's no need to sort of mix it in or anything like that. So the idea is, as the water is doing its cycles within the glass vessel, any sort of toxins or impurities are captured or absorbed by the activated charcoal. Next up is our soil. So I'm just going to start adding handfuls of this. And I usually fill up the terrarium to an imaginary halfway mark, and then I sort of tamp down the soil so it sits just below that halfway mark. You can, if you like, create your terrarium on a bit of a gradient. However, for a terrarium like this, I quite like to just keep it on a flat surface. I quite like to start with the largest plant in the center, and then I kind of spiral out with the smaller plants. However, with this opening, I think it's probably going to be a better idea to start from the outside inside, as it might be quite tricky to maneuver around that sort of central plant. So I think I'm going to go for the Ginseng Ficus, a bit of the sort of more reddish Fittonia. Useful little pillar to include in that. So I'm going to start removing the plants from the pots. So gently massaging those roots. You want to get as much of the soil of the roots as possible without, of course, damaging the roots. Right, I'm quite happy with that. I'm going to place that to one side and again massage those roots. And in this case, I have a couple. Now for the pilia, or the friendship plants. I think that arrangements of odd numbers always just look better, but it's something to consider anyway whilst you're doing your planting. So I'm going to grab my chopstick and I'm just going to start burrowing a hole in the soil using sort of circular motions, and I usually stop when I hit the drainage layer at the bottom. And I'm going to start with my Fittonia. Now you can use your chopsticks or tongs to lower the plant down, but because I can get my hand into the glass vessel, I'm just going to place it into the roots into the hole that I've created for them. You can make sure that your plant is securely planted by doing a little tug test on the leaves. If the plant comes out of the soil, then you know you just need to secure it a little bit better. And again, burrowing a hole with the chopstick. Now, when I'm planting, I do like to keep my planting as central as possible. I don't want to see leaves pressed up against the glass. Leaves are always going to touch the glass, but it's when you see leaves pressed up against the glass, that's usually where they become quite transparent and watery, and I usually find mold sort of tends to break out more at that point. Again, lowering the pilia into the hole. And I'm going to have to move him back a little bit just because those leaves are really pressing up against the glass. You might also want to trim down any leaves that aren't serving your terrarium. And once you've trimmed off those leaves, just be sure to remove those. So this is often a good stage to start just cleaning the inside of the glass. Now, I really love adding moss to terrariums. I feel like it just completes the whole sort of miniature landscape. I usually use the bun moss to create the sort of mounded shapes. And what I'm doing now is I'm just removing the base of the moss. These are rhizoids. I'm not actually damaging the moss by doing this, so don't worry too much. It's not as if we were removing the roots of a plant, for example. And now what I'm going to do is just sort of dust off this surface. Now I usually hold the green of the moss against the inside of the glass. So try to bear that in mind as you slide the moss down the glass. I press the moss with my fingers against the inside of the glass, and then with my thumb I kind of round the shape of the moss, really sort of emphasizing that lovely sort of clump shape. I'm quite happy with that. And I also quite like to make sure some sort of foliage is draping over the moss, just so that it feels like it's integrating nicely with the planting around it. I think it can look a little bit separate and disconnected otherwise. I only tend to add 1 or 2 clumps of moss. I always try and avoid the sort of moat of moss. So I'm going to add my second section now of this beautiful bun moss. I always find moss to be a really good indicator of what's happening inside the terrarium. When the moss starts to look a little bit pale and even starts to split a little bit, I usually think maybe there's not enough moisture. With the green of the moss against the inside of the glass. Now, I'm pretty happy with this. I might add a little bit of the sheet moss. Just to give a little bit of a different sort of texture. Now for the final layer, I quite like to use slate on the surface of the soil. I personally don't mind seeing these sections of soil. However, you might want to just finish it off with a different surface. And I just sort of drop the slate in around the side, and then with the paintbrush or another tool, I then kind of just maneuver the bits closer to the center. And now for the cherry on the top, I'm going to include a piece of this beautiful amethyst. Now I quite like it to look almost a bit hidden or tucked away. So I do try to sort of bury it a little bit and then kind of have some foliage sort of hiding it away a little bit, like a little sort of secret. And of course, really cleaning down the insides of the glass. You can use your kitchen roll at this stage as well. I find a sponge on a bamboo stick often does the trick. And a paintbrush on the bamboo as well is good for really just sort of dusting off the leaves. Now, all that's left to do is to place the lid on the terrarium, and you can congratulate yourself on your beautiful new miniature garden. Before I go, here's a little bit on how to care for your terrarium. Now, I very seldomly add water to my terrariums. I always like to see about 50% condensation, 50% clear glass during the day. Never have your terrarium in direct sunlight. The glass of the terrarium can act as a magnifying glass and singe the plants. If it's looking a little bit sludgy and there's a lot of moisture in the terrarium, simply remove the lid and just leave it off overnight. That should reset everything within. If the opposite's happening and you're not having any condensation building up, you might want to consider moving your terrarium into a brighter spot. You might need to do a bit of housekeeping from time to time. Always keep leaves trimmed down. As I was saying, when leaves start to press up against the glass, it's probably a good idea to trim them. Any mold in the terrarium has to go. Be sure to trim it out as quickly as you see it. And if it's spread to the entire plant, you're going to have to just take the whole plant out. Right, that's it. Thank you for making a terrarium with me today. My name is Alyson Mowat, and I wish you all the luck in making many more little miniature gardens.